Thank you very much. Good morning and welcome. It is my great honour and privilege to be here today. My name is Colin Hunter IV. I would like to start off with acknowledging that this morning we are on Wurundjeri country, home of my ancestors and also home to everybody here today. I wish to pay my respects to both elders past, present and emerging, elders from all nations, especially all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members joining us here today. Wurundjeri is a part of the Kulin Nation and the Wurrung language group. Wurundjeri country extends from the inner city of Melbourne, across to the Great Dividing Range, west to the Werribee River, south to the Mordialloc Creek and east to Mount Baw Baw. A big thank you to everybody who has helped make this event possible this morning. Wominjeka, welcome, and I hope everybody has a fantastic afternoon ahead. Thank you very much for your time and enjoy.
Thank you so much, Uncle Colin Hunter Jr., for that acknowledgement of country, and I'd like to extend my own acknowledgement of country and recognise the people here on the Wurundjeri as the traditional owners of the Kulin Nation, the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people. I also want to recognise the leadership shown by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in caring for kids, kin and country right across Australia, including people joining us in the room today and those online. And indeed to recognise the continuing advocacy by community members, by families, by practitioners, by researchers, and perhaps most importantly for the conversation today, by people with their own experience of family violence, of its impacts, of the resilience that it takes to survive it and to bring real meaning to the stories that we're seeing in the research that we're publishing. We've got a lot of expertise in the room today. We've got a fantastic panel to help us unpack the findings of the research, but we've also got an incredible amount of expertise and knowledge from people who really want to help be part of what we do with those research findings and how we use those in the practice and the policy work ahead. And I did want to acknowledge in particular Meena Singh, Commissioner for Aboriginal Children here in Victoria, someone who I've been really privileged to learn with and from in my own work in this area. As I said, I'm Tessa Boyd-Kane. I'm CEO here at ANROWS, Australia's National Research Organisation for Women's Safety. And this is the first event that we've held to really unpack the findings from our recently released report on Filicides in a domestic and family violence context, looking at children killed within that context over an 8-year period from 2010 to 2018. The study was a study conducted in partnership between ANROWS and the Australian Domestic and Family Violence Death Review Network, an incredibly important partnership looking to make sense of the data, understand the stories and see what are the lessons that those insights can point us towards in terms of intervening early, preventing and supporting families and particularly children in the context of domestic and family violence. At ANROWS, our role is both to build the evidence to support improving the safety and protecting women and children in the context of the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children, but really importantly, helping us make use of those evidence findings, helping us inform policy directions and practice as part of those opportunities to intervene earlier and to prevent that violence in people's lives. This is an incredibly and in fact devastatingly timely conversation to be having as our national attention looks increasingly to the impacts on children in the context of family violence. We recognise that it's distressing, we recognise that this work has real impacts in all of our lives, and we want to just make a note in response to the need to look after ourselves, to take care of ourselves as we have these conversations. So you will have received, as you registered, and we'll have information up throughout the course of this event, just reminding people how to make sure that you take care of yourself in the here and now as we have this conversation and in the continuing work around it. We've made a decision in the context of this event this morning not to hold an audience Q&A. That is partly because we've got a packed schedule to make sure that we hear from a range of different insights, a range of different experts thinking about the issues that the report highlights. But it's also informed by advice we've had from trauma management specialists who really recommended this approach as part of how we look after people in the conversation. And with so many viewers online, we think there's likely to be a terrific number of really important questions. So what we're going to invite you to do is to use the QR code that you'll see, again, through slides here, to feed through your questions, and we'll take those on notice and provide responses back to you as part of the follow-up from this event. So please see that QR code, make use of that now and as questions come to you through the event, and know that this is our commitment to opening up this conversation and to continuing it past the hour and a half that we spend together today. I want to move now to introduce Anne O'Neill. We're really privileged to have Anne join us today. And as I mentioned, the importance of lived experience in situating and contextualising research is critical at all points, but perhaps no more so than in the kind of content that we're talking about today, understanding the stories that are the living insights around the research, the evidence and the data in our report. Anne is a survivor, a clinician and a researcher. She's experienced great loss and demonstrated exceptional resilience in her survival through that experience. She's not here to tell a story, but to share the reality of that experience with us today, one that she shares with too many children, women and families. So Anne, can I invite you up, and thank you.
Thank you and good morning, everyone. Wow. Thank you for the lovely welcome to country from Uncle Colin Hunter Jr. And thank you for the opportunity to speak. Without an audience, there's no one to hear, there's no one to understand, and there's no one to change. So whether you're here in the room physically or online, and I'm not sure where that camera is, but hi. I think it's a really important part to value the real imperativeness, if that's a word, of the audience being here today. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Wurundjeri lands, of the people of the Kulin Nation, and the leaders of nations across this country and wherever people are joining us online today. I often reflect on the incredible injustice that First Nations people experience and the rate at which filicide is experienced in their community as a result of that trauma. And that's particularly distressing to me. And I have had the opportunity to walk beside many families grappling with such loss. And I don't think that even though I may not have been from the most privileged context, that you can ever truly deeply understand the context unless it's your context, and the layers of injustice that are experienced and how hard that is to hold. But in that, I've been absolutely privileged and amazed. People say to me all the time, Anne, the work you do, isn't it, so hard and depressing and horrid, and how do you deal with it? But it's the resilience of the human spirit that absolutely amazes me, and the privilege to stand beside people at their most vulnerable and to see, particularly in First Nations people, that leadership that they have in terms of the survival of their culture, their people and themselves. It's such a space that we can learn more from. So I really want to acknowledge that management of that intergenerational trauma and the systemic trauma that First Nations people live with. And language is so important, and I, like everybody else, can be clumsy. So I'm sorry if today I am at all clumsy and I touch tender parts of people without meaning to. Self-care, as you've already shared for us, thank you, Tessa. Do reach out to your usual supports and those that have been shared with you today. And I say this because this topic, if it was on TV, would come with an R rating. It talks about violence and adult themes. It involves sexual abuse and acts like that we would just put warnings all over. However, when it's on the news or it's real, it doesn't come with that warning. And I often joke and say, you know, if I were a DVD or, I don't know, an app now, do they have ratings on apps? You know, I'd be R-rated in that I talk about violence and adult themes, but at my age, don't worry, there'll only be 4-letter words. There won't be any nudity. So this topic, it's so much easier to talk about the other stuff, isn't it? Because this is a topic I never wanted to be an expert in, and I still don't know that I'm an expert. However, 30 years ago next month, I got thrust into a world where I was up close and personal with the killing of children by a parent. It changed my world. However, it would be nearly 2 years before I came to understand that the killing of my 2 children by their father was in fact an act of domestic violence, one that marked a dramatic end to an ongoing pattern of covert, coercive abuse that had gradually increased to include physical assault and stalking. It was in the aftermath of these events that I really came to understand how little professionals and community members understood about domestic or family violence or sexual abuse or child abuse, and how systemic responses lacked insight and compassion. And one of the first things that people used to say to me was, "What did you do to make him do that?" It was the most common question that I got asked, and I was shocked. And I can be a bit flippant, but it took me about 15 years to realise that, you know, the best response was, well, actually, I was in bed, asleep, breathing. I think that's what pissed him off. And as I did warn you about the 4-letter words in the language, so thank you. But these systemic responses, they were the systems that lacked the compassion, not the people, and I really want to highlight that. I was shocked when their death certificates eventually arrived several years later and stated that they died through unlawful homicide by a person since deceased, that he wasn't even named, that history did not record that piece of crucial information. I learned it wasn't considered murder unless there'd been a court hearing where someone had been found or had pleaded guilty. The superannuation companies were profit-driven, not human-focused. Despite losing my right leg, and I use losing in inverted commas, if you see it, please let me know. But the superannuation companies, you know, they deemed that the 40 seconds that lapsed between the children dying and he dying, and because I hadn't asked for spousal support, meant that on his time of death, I wasn't financially dependent upon him, so I couldn't access his superannuation. It took me 5 years and several $1,000s to even access that money. I learned that the criminal injuries compensation designed to help people impacted by such crimes was so limited due to it consolidating all the crimes into effectively one. It allowed me only to claim one maximum amount, which was $50,000. And at the time, the crime cost me $45,000 to bury everybody and pay his debts. I was very fortunate I had someone help me to table for an ex gratia payment, which gave me at least enough to study and re-establish myself. And that was a precedent for victims of crime in Western Australia. That hadn't been done before. I learnt that police didn't understand that stalking, intimidation, harassment and social isolation, when coupled with instances under the law, of course, were considered when there was physical assault, then it could be deemed under the law to be family and domestic violence, and or that these behaviours were not and should not be considered, and I put in inverted commas, what might be considered the normal behaviour for a man going through a separation, as was submitted to the coroner by the police investigating our situation. All of that said, these systemic re-victimisations and deficits, procedural things that meant that my heart broke over and over again, were restored. And my faith in humanity was greatly buoyed time and time again, because when I did eventually speak out publicly and began to get asked to do it more, people would approach me. They would share their lived experiences. Professionals and organisations would say, how do we stop this? How do we help? What do we do? And at the time, I have to say, I felt like an imposter, because here I was, someone who at that stage had left school at the end of year 10, obviously made a great choice in a partner, and, how was I going to tell all these intelligent people what needed to happen to change? So that was when I set about my learning journey, so I could actually be informed beyond my own experience to try and understand how we did walk side by side with people with lived experience and professionals and have a conversation, very uncomfortable conversations, about how we can prevent not only family and domestic and sexual abuse, but the inherent child abuse within these contexts. At the time, it was and still is very confronting to think, let alone talk, about the killing of a child or children, especially when it involves their parents as perpetrators. And in 1998, for Reclaim the Night, I wrote a poem, and it's called I Wonder Why. I read the paper, and as I wonder why, I cry. I cry for all those whose lives have been taken. Forgive me for saying, as I might be mistaken, because I don't have all the information. But how could anything have been a justification for the taking of another's life, regardless of it be it by a husband or a wife? And as I watch the community grapple with the issue of blame, I feel such an overwhelming sense of shame that I live in a place that many can condone the taking of lives that one themselves have sown. Somehow, some think it makes it an act of love and devotion. On the other hand, the result of total frustration. For many, it's beyond their belief, so they shut out the reality to get some relief. Therefore, they can escape their own vulnerability and fear. Yet, for the families left behind, it will never disappear. The second time I shared that poem was about 12 months later, when in WA we'd had a 12-month period in which 16 children had died at the hand of a parent. And that included David, Aaron and Ashley, whose names are the only ones I have permission to use today. And at an apolitical candlelight vigil that we gathered around as survivors and organised to share and acknowledge the grief and the injustice that these families were navigating, I felt such absolute rage when I think about it then and now. Rage that the media had been filled with coverage of the Columbine school massacre, and rightly so, in which 12 children and a teacher died. And my thoughts are still with all of those impacted by this and all other injustices. However, there was a rage that there we were in WA, and we'd had 16 children killed in 1 year, and there was no outpouring of rage, no outpouring of grief, just a small group of 150 people at the most. No big community leaders, no politicians, mainly police, refuge workers and everyday community members, and very, very limited media coverage. And that rage was only fuelled when, within hours of this vigil, 50,000 West Australians turned out to protest that a football team had to move home ground. And they didn't want that. Rage that nearly 25 years later, and this report tells us that as a nation, on average, we have 17 children die each year in the time period covered. 13 of those in the context of DV, still more than Columbine. We all know Columbine, we all know the victims, and we don't know the victims within our own nation. For all these years, I felt that rage, and I've continued to ask why. Why do children continue to be killed? And why isn't everyone so upset? I tell myself, and I console myself so I can keep doing the work that we do, that perhaps it's because people don't understand why, and how we get here. Perhaps it's because society doesn't like to talk about death. That's so uncomfortable, let's move on to the weather. Unless it's murdertainment on TV, we can talk about murdertainment. Perhaps it's because we're taught at school not to put our hand up if we don't know the exact answer or the solution. And it's this last concept that has felt most right to me. With everybody I've met, there's been this earnest desire to understand, and yet this uncomfortableness that if I don't know what to do, if I don't know what to say, then I will say and do nothing. And then somehow it happens that we tend to ignore it. And thus, I am absolutely excited to be here today with this amazing research team and this report, because Dr. Holly Blackmore and Anna Butler, with the incredible leadership of, and what we now have, the Australian Domestic and Family Violence Death Review Network and ANROWS, Australia's national research organisation for women's safety. And within these organisations and you people, you've cared enough, you've felt the rage, and you've championed this topic as a topic that was in need of understanding and research, a need to be that voice. And I'm elated, I'm a little bit scared about glad it's 2,000 people online, not in the room. And it tells us that there is a real desire, a strong, deep yearning and a share of my rage that we want to understand not only the numbers. This report is so different to so many others because it just doesn't count the numbers and say this is the incident. It digs deeper and it helps us to better understand the depth, breadth and context of the abuse that they suffer before they die, so that we as individuals, communities, service providers and governments can be informed and actively involved in saving other children from living in similar abusive environments and dying similar deaths. So it is with the deepest of gratitude and a new sense of hope that I stand here and I beg you all, and I told you I was going to use 4-letter words, well, rage is the biggest one, and I want us to harness our collective rage, and I want it to be a word in which women who are not often encouraged to say it or feel it, and we certainly don't encourage other people to feel it very often, but we should be empowered by it. We should take it, and for the next 25 years, we should mix it with 2 other 4-letter words, the ones we can't use in Parliament or business: love and hope. And it breaks my heart that we can't use those words in business or in Parliament, because you can use the F word in Parliament, I believe. We had a big debate about that a few years ago. So if we take those unspeakable words of rage, love and hope, and we create together understandings where we can stand collectively and never stop being that voice. Thank you.
And can I relay back to you the gratitude that you expressed for being here, because what you've brought to us in your own insight and experience is so critical to help really make sense of, as you say, that these are more than numbers. And also the work ahead. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't have love and hope as foundational words in politics, in policy, in practice, because they're critical to life. And so I really, really value that encouragement from you. I also really value that invitation to think about systems and where is the compassion in systems, because if we're thinking about what does the evidence tell us in terms of context as a way to make sense of how do we make systems more effective, then compassion at the heart of that, community thriving at the heart of that has to be a core purpose. So thank you. In the past 2 weeks since we released the report, I've had so many conversations with people about the findings where there was in equal measure deep distress about the findings of that research, matched with equally deep desire to understand what is the context in which this violence is occurring. Because if we can understand that context, we can get closer to intervening earlier and to preventing those most devastating impacts. And that's what brings us here today, to listen and to learn. And so I want to move now to introduce Dr. Holly Blackmore and Anna Butler, two people among a core group of people without whom we would not have this research, without whom we would not have the insights from the report that we've just released. Dr. Holly Blackmore is an experienced researcher specialising in domestic, family and sexual violence, as well as femicide and filicide. And she's the research manager for Death Review at ANROWS, contributing to multiple research projects, including as a lead author on this one. And Anna Butler is chair of the Australian Domestic Family Violence Death Review Network. She manages the Domestic Violence Death Review team at the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice, and Anna brings a wealth of experience across policy and practice. In presenting the research and helping us unpack the findings today, Holly and Anna are the face of a really important partnership between ANROWS and the National National Death Review Network. The importance of that partnership is because the holders of the knowledge, the holders of the insights about this context are often working in very isolated ways, in very, very important contexts, without necessarily the support or the opportunity to collaborate about the meaning that we can make, unless they do that in a coordinated way. And so the coming together of the Death Review Network, featuring the states and territories across the country that are trying to make sense of these deaths in their own context, coming together with each other and with ANROWS gives us a really powerful way of making sense of, as we've seen in this research, filicide in the context of family violence, but thinking more broadly about where are we seeing deaths in the context of violence against women and children, violence in the context of family violence. So we're really grateful as ANROWS to the Death Review Network. We're really pleased to be part of the sense-making, bringing meaning to the data and helping share the insights of this really important work with you all. Anna, Holly, thank you.
Yeah, if you would, that'd be good. I'll just pull up some slides. Thanks for that, Tessa. Holly and I would also like to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal people here today and joining us online. Thank you, Uncle Colin Hunter Jr. for your welcome to country, and to Anne for such a powerful opening address. Your work in fostering hope and healing for people whose lives have been struck by tragedy and struck by trauma, and then also promoting awareness and understanding for people whose lives haven't been interrupted by trauma is truly inspirational. A word that gets thrown around a bit, but I think absolutely fitting here. So before we hand over to our excellent panel, we just wanted to share some of the key findings from the National Filicide Report. As Tessa mentioned, this is work that's been done as part of this collaborative project between the Australian Domestic and Family Violence Death Review Network and the Death Review team at ANROWS. So in short, the project involved developing a national data set on filicide, so the killing of a child by a parent or parents, with a focus on filicides that occurred in a context of domestic and family violence. So by this we mean that there was an identifiable history of violence preceding the filicide. So any evidence of physical, emotional or sexual violence by a parent against the child or their siblings, and it also included evidence of intimate partner violence between the children's parents. Just reiterating Tessa's comments, this work is really confronting, it's distressing. We're talking about the homicides of children, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, and these children's experiences of violence before they were killed. I do note we won't be presenting any details or names or images in relation to any individual cases. But we really want to acknowledge that every figure reflected in this report represents a young life taken and enduring devastation for those left behind. In undertaking this work, we aim to honour the lives of the children killed and share learnings from these deaths to improve the response to domestic and family violence and thereby hopefully prevent future loss of life. We hope this work improves our understanding of filicide and domestic and family violence and contributes to all the amazing work that's being done across the country to keep children and families safe, well and thriving. Just by way of very brief background to the Network ANROWS partnership, which, as we've said, is what made this research possible. So the network is comprised of representatives from each state and territory in Australia, and most of these are from the formal DFV death review mechanism in that state or territory. So the death reviews have access to extensive demographic and case characteristic information and insights into the victims' and offenders' lives and their experiences of violence in the weeks, or months and often years that precede the fatal episode. So death reviews examine the various touch points in the lives of victims and offenders, and we're looking at the kind of nature and quality of service engagement, thinking about who was aware of the violence and what was done to try and interrupt it and to support victims of violence. The reviews aim to better understand and redress the challenges that exist in the response system and in the community more broadly, and then to really kind of draw learnings from these fatalities to promote positive reform. And then in 2020, ANROWS was funded by the Australian Government Department of Social Services to establish a collaborative partnership with the network. The partnership has produced 2 reports to date, so the second edition of the Intimate Partner Homicide Report, so that's the report on the left there, and now the Filicide Report. So this Filicide study examined the deaths of children aged under 18 who were killed by a parent or parents in Australia between 2010 and 2018. Data was sourced from each of the death review teams around Australia, as well as some additional data drawn from the National Coronial Information System. So this work involved Holly travelling to each state and territory and working with the death reviews to examine their filicide case files. So she was looking at briefs of evidence, police reports, inquest findings, autopsy and toxicology reports, case notes from service providers, and then sort of anecdotal accounts via witness statements and victim impact statements from friends and family, and then any of the in-depth case reviews that have been prepared by the death review in that particular jurisdiction. So a really broad range of information that was drawn on. So we identified 113 filicides in Australia across the 8-year reporting period. So that involved 127 filicide offenders and 138 child victims. So in a number of cases, more than one child was killed in the fatal episode. And then there were also a small number of cases where both parents were held to be criminally responsible for the child's death. The case file information was reviewed to determine whether the filicide was preceded by a history of domestic and family violence. Which, as I said, that means where we saw in the material evidence of child abuse or intimate partner violence. And this could be something drawn from a kind of service records, so police reports or any other kind of service record, or the violence may not have been reported to services but was evident, say, from some witness statements from families and friends. So we found around 3/4 of filicides occurred in a context of DFV. So this was 86 filicide cases, which resulted in the deaths of 106 children. And these filicides were perpetrated by 99 offenders. So the report really focuses and sort of drills down on the 86 DFV context filicides. And we'll just look at some of those, 5 of the key findings from the study. So firstly, the research found that a history of child abuse, intimate partner violence or both was common in the weeks, months or years leading up to a DFV context filicide. The findings show that a prior history of violence against a child was evident in about 8 in 10 cases, so 78%. So this means that for 22% of the cases there was no history of violence directed against the child, and the DFV context related to the intimate partner violence between the child's parents and that child's experience of that violence. Prior intimate partner violence was perpetrated or experienced by the filicide offender in about 9 in 10 cases, and then this, really demonstrating this kind of critical, albeit very complex, intersection of intimate partner violence and filicide. And in many of the cases, children were in fact experiencing both child abuse and the intimate partner violence between the parents. So another key finding relates to the gendered pattern of offending. So approximately 2/3 of filicide offenders were men and 1/3 were women. And if we look closer at the offender's experiences or perpetration of intimate partner violence prior to the filicide, we see that the primary perpetrator of intimate partner violence was almost always male, 97%, whereas the primary victim survivor of the intimate partner violence was almost always female. So I think while a gendered approach is generally understood and acknowledged when responding to intimate partner violence, these findings demonstrate how important it is that a gendered approach is also needed when responding to violence against children. These patterns can help inform responses for children and their families, and importantly, really highlights that a risk of violence to women must be recognised as a risk to children. Now I'll hand over to Holly. Oh, sorry.
Thanks, Anna. And so alongside these histories of violence and the gendered patterns of offending, we found that filicide offenders were frequently experiencing multiple complex issues. Now then, these issues don't necessarily cause violence, rather they point to potential opportunities for preventing filicides and domestic and family violence. So we saw that women more commonly experience mental health issues, so 72% of women who'd killed their child compared to 48% of men who had killed their child. We also identified that women more commonly had a known history of experiencing domestic and family violence in their childhood. That's 59% compared to 37% of men. Whereas it was more common for men to have an identifiable issue or substance abuse issue at the time of the filicide, so 61% versus 41% of women. And men also more commonly had a violent criminal history, 80% compared to 36% of women, and that's of the subgroup of offenders who did have a criminal history. It's also worth noting that this project, we also did a bit of a preliminary mapping of the various service touchpoints for families, which served as a bit of an indication of child visibility and potential intervention opportunities. We saw multiple services had contact with families, which really speaks to multiple opportunities. But further work is needed to learn more about what these kind of service touchpoints look like, both from families, from people who work in this space, and also from death review data. The findings relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander victims and offenders must be considered with respect to the colonial context and structural violence of the historical and current Australian landscape, including the systemic racism and the intergenerational trauma that persists. While the findings demonstrate that most filicide victims were neither Aboriginal nor Torres Strait Islander, we can see that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were overrepresented when you compare that to the actual rates of the population. And it should also be noted that around 1 in 5 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were killed by a non-Indigenous parent. Again, most offenders were not Aboriginal nor Torres Strait Islander. However, the overrepresentation of First Nations offenders can be seen when compared to the broader Australian population. This is an important yet complex finding, and it's something that we examine in more detail in the report. What I will say now, though, is that First Nations expertise is needed to inform and lead responses to domestic and family violence. Child removal is not an effective intervention and prevention strategy. To prevent DFE context filicides and improve the safety and well-being of children and families everywhere, it requires sustained investment in responding and stopping intimate partner violence and family violence more broadly. Another key finding that was highlighted was the real physical vulnerability of often very young children or infants in their own home, and the high proportion of children who had experienced domestic and family violence prior to their death really highlights the need for children to be centred in responses to violence and recognised as victims of domestic and family violence in their own right. Specifically, nearly half of the children were aged under 2 years, with the largest proportion being aged under 1 year old. Sorry. It's also really important to acknowledge the 122 surviving siblings across these cases, and this is likely a significant underestimate. These siblings have their own experiences of violence and grief, and we really need to hold space for their needs in our conversations about children, about violence, and about filicide. Now, that was just a snapshot of the findings from the report. Essentially, the findings are telling us that children must be recognised as victims of domestic and family violence in their own right and prioritised in prevention efforts. Additionally, understanding these really gendered patterns of DFV context filicide offending is really crucial in shaping our responses. It's also really important to recognise numbers are tricky. They rarely measure the full scope of a problem, yet they're an important tool in enhancing our grasp of the impact of violence, especially when we continue to learn and improve upon how we collect and contextualise data. This partnership is an opportunity to vastly improve our national understanding of the impacts and extent of domestic and family violence. And I do want to take this opportunity to thank the network for their expertise, their dedication, and the real care that they bring to this work. It's been a true privilege to work with them. We do have a QR code here also. We do want to hear directly from people in the room, as well as the many joining us via live stream. If you have questions, we do want to hear from you. And finally, just a really heartfelt thanks to everyone who's here today, for showing up in what you do and for listening and participating in this conversation. It's really hard, it's confronting, yet children really need to be seen and placed at the centre of our conversations around domestic and family violence always. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna and Holly, for that lightning tour through a really critical report that really points the way, I think, to what we can do with research in terms of understanding systems and making them more effective. I'm going to take a moment now to invite our panel to join me up on the stage, and as they do that, I'm going to move us into the next part of the discussion. So please, panellists, come and take a seat, and I'll introduce you once you're up here so people can see who you are. But what we're going to do now is move into a panel discussion that really helps us make sense of the data and the findings in that report. And I think that's critically important because, as we've said, this is the first time we've had a report that looks at the experience of children being killed in the family context, in the context of domestic and family violence. But it's also something that we know can be understood from so many different lenses. And so this panel discussion is really an opportunity to hear from a varied set of experts, each with deep experience, and to think about what we do collectively to better identify patterns of abuse and their impacts on children, to make that visible, and to ensure that our responses centre the experience of children in the context of domestic and family violence. Our focus for this panel discussion is very much on actions, on what can we do with the knowledge that we have. And we can't think of a better set of experts to help us make sense of the research and the report for this purpose. So you've heard already from Anne in the context of her own advocacy and leadership in this space. I also want to introduce Professor Kylie Cripps from Monash University, a leading researcher on child abuse and Indigenous family violence. And Kylie was an expert advisor on the project, for which we thank you, Kylie. I want to introduce Biljana Milosevic, the director of Janawi Family Centre, based in Sydney, but joining us here in person today. Emeritus Professor Thea Brown AM from Monash University, a leading researcher on filicide, and Professor Daryl Higgins from the Australian Catholic University and one of the chief investigators of the Australian Child Maltreatment Study. We were going to have this panel facilitated by Kate Fitzgibbon. Unfortunately, Kate hasn't been able to join us today, so I'm going to step in. Forgive me as I pick up the conversation, but know that we're in very safe and trusted hands with this incredible group of experts. So I want to start first, Kylie, by coming to you to ask you to reflect on the data that we've seen, and particularly how we represent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families in this work. And so really interested to hear from you why context is so important in making sense of this work.
I think context is super important because when we look at the stories behind the numbers, it tells us the significance of engagement around access to services. It talks to us about how people get entrapped in domestic and family violence circumstances. It talks to us about racism. And it means that when we think to solutions, when we think to accountability in systems, it means that we have to look at this in a really complex way. It's not, there is no one solution. There are a range of ways that we have to look at this. And context actually means that we have to look at all the layers that are involved in this. The number itself is meaningless unless we actually appreciate the context of the family and what was going on for the family in that moment, and how we could wrap better services and supports around that family with no judgment.
Thanks, Kylie. And then, so thinking about how we make sense of that in the context of the research, what are your reflections about how we involve First Nations expertise in that work?
I think what's important is that we have Indigenous researchers involved, because it's that importance of, and that was what was beautiful about working with the team, was actually sitting with the team and saying, even the importance of how do we ensure that we're getting the numbers right? Because in some states, the recording of Aboriginality is abysmal. And so how do we, look at all of this information that we have before us and double check the data around service access and the recording of Aboriginality? How do we understand context better? And it is that layered approach of having Aboriginal researchers involved in the process to enable that context and that nuance to come through. And that, I think, is really critical to understanding the problem better, because without that insight, we have the problem that stereotypes could be produced if we don't get that context right, but also you want community to have buy-in, right? So if the context is right and you've got community being involved in producing something like this, then community is also involved in making the difference around how we do prevention moving forward.
Thanks, Kylie. Thea, can I come to you as someone who has worked extensively across filicide for some time, really interested in what findings stood out for you, and particularly whether you're seeing recurring or complementary findings that we really need to be paying attention to?
Much. I just add to what Kylie's saying that the identification of Aboriginality in the databases is extremely poor. I have to say the identification of lots of people's origins is also very poor in the databases, but we wouldn't have realised it just using the database until the cluster inquest in Victoria, where an argument broke out between the workers as to whether this child was Aboriginal or not, and we had the child recorded as non-Aboriginal, and it was very clear from the discussion that they were, and it made us wonder how many other children were wrongly labelled as well. But before I talk about the relationship of your report to our findings, might I just say how good your report is and to congratulate you on it, and to congratulate the funders, the sponsors, the researchers, the network, everybody who made it possible, and how important the report is. And I think that I hope that it will carry us forward. As people probably know, the Monash Deakin Filicide Research Hub has undertaken 3 filicide studies, all Australian studies, 2 state ones, Victoria, and 1 national one, and our findings largely agree with your findings. We have approached things a bit differently. In the last study, which we undertook with the support and cooperation and collaboration of the Victorian Coroner's Court, we wanted to move on to tackle the issue that you're raising, which is where do we go next? And our view about where we should go next was that we should start looking at perpetrator characteristics so that we could develop profiles of perpetrators to pass those profiles on to services. And so we started from a point of thinking that there were constellations of factors around perpetrators, and in fact that's what we found. There are dense constellations around perpetrators, but that they vary according to the parent type. So that there's a constellation for mothers, there's a constellation for fathers, and there's a constellation for stepfathers. We did not identify any constellation for the joint acts, which you sometimes get. We thought it was very important that we note that they are different. They are not the same for each type of perpetrator. And then within those types, there are sub-constellations as well. And because we were able to identify those constellations, we could start to see the dynamics within the constellation, which we thought was very relevant to services. We have prepared an article identifying those constellations, which is resting with the Coroner's Court, and we're waiting for it to be cleared so it can be published. But we would say that you are right about the importance in the constellation of intimate partner violence and child abuse. They probably are the most commonly occurring factors in the constellation, but also you've got, as you found in your report, very high concentrations of mental illness, parental separation, which actually I don't think you went into, drug, illicit substance abuse, criminal history, and we found in our most recent study the experience of migration. I don't think I've covered all the factors that we found, but I hope I have. Another one was breach of orders. So from there, thinking that we could feed this information into services, we wanted to look at what were services doing with perpetrators. And as you found, services are in contact with perpetrators. And in our study, we had I think the average contact was 3 to 5 agencies were in contact with the perpetrator. But the notion of contact implies engagement, and that was completely misleading. There was no engagement. There was hardly ever any engagement. And we had mothers on the one hand commonly in contact with maternal and child health services, but drifting away from them fairly quickly and not taking up referrals, and nobody followed them up. The centres didn't follow them up, and the people that they were referred to didn't follow them up. Fathers and stepfathers equally had contact with services, 3 to 5 services, mostly child protection, but they didn't engage with child protection, and child protection couldn't engage with them. They evaded and eluded, and stepfathers were particularly invisible. So we thought from there that where we needed to go was acknowledging that there was contact, but the contact wasn't working, it was failing. And so we needed to develop new models to assist potential perpetrators in these circumstances, particularly noting the risk profiles of perpetrators. And we thought that services needed to change their models, and we have some recommendations about different models, which I'll leave to some other time. But the message that you're driving home is the sadness of children in these circumstances and the appalling consequences of what happens to them, and that we must move forward, we must make children more visible, and we must take action on their behalf.
Thanks so much, Thea. I'm going to pick up that where you've left us in a moment with Biljana, but I think you've also reminded us of the importance of understanding how and why people use violence as such a critical part of the evidence, and just to recognise that that's been signalled so clearly from the federal government in terms of the next directions of work. It's very clearly in focus for us at ANROWS in terms of the research that we're now commissioning, so that we start to complement the really critical insights from victim survivors, the really critical insights from people who've experienced that violence, with a better understanding about who's using it, and really bringing that analysis and understanding into the directions that we set from here. But with that, Biljana, can I come to you? And I think the question that this conversation is just naturally bringing us to is, what does it really mean to make children visible in this work? And particularly to think about who is responsible for ensuring children's voices, needs and strengths are reflected in, as Anne put it so clearly, the system. When we think about risk assessment, when we think about points of intervention and support, and when we think about how decision making supports safety and enables children to thrive.
Thanks for that really small question. I think we need to take a step back and think about why are children still invisible. We've been talking about children's visibility in the domestic violence space for about 50 years now, 40 years, and it still hasn't happened in a way. But I think when we think about the gendered nature of what the report showed is about how do we actually support fathering and mothering. So I know we talk about women and men, but the majority of the men who murdered their children were biological fathers. And so how do we include fathering assessments? How do we include how men actually parent? We do parenting assessments of women all the time, but do we do assessments of men as fathers? And are they authoritarian? Are they punitive? What approach would they use with their children? The prenatal spaces as well. There's a big gap in how we support both women and men, but mothers and fathers in that prenatal and antenatal space, which when you think about the majority of children were murdered within 2 months of their birth. Like, that's a very significant finding. That's really struck me when I read the report, and that unique kind of space that we could be intervening in that way, that children do provide a beautiful way into intervention and engagement, and yet we miss that by doing purely criminal justice responses or purely women as victim responses rather than how does this work as a family response. But I just want to do also a call out about the fact that we're allowed to physically assault children in this country, that it's legal, that we're allowed to discipline and correct behaviour, and the fact that the children were brutally murdered through physical assault is also an indicator about when are we going to, as a nation, have a conversation around assaulting children is just unacceptable. And it's their human right to be safe in their homes. And so those legal constructs and systems also have a part to play, particularly as well when we have victim survivors seeking protection orders but children not enlisted on those protection orders. It also gives a message that the children are somehow going to be okay or they're not at risk. And so we have this dichotomy of men who are good men, or they might be good fathers, but they're not great as men. We still have a lot of cultural, systemic changes to work through in that space to be able to keep children visible. And the other thing as well is how do we as a professional service system really start to understand trauma indicators for children, that we can see trauma indicators in children's development and behaviour quite early on in the piece for babies and for infants. And I'm just not sure in this country that we're very good and nuanced at doing that. That's across the board, from teachers to early childhood nurses to professionals and social workers to child protection workers. Our ability to understand trauma indicators and what children are trying to tell us, we're missing the mark there, and we have been for a very long time. Yep.
Thanks, Biljana. It's such an important reflection to think about what good looks like and how we engage people in good parenting. And it's a really beautiful point, Anne, to bring you into the conversation because you've advocated so strongly for strengths-based language. And an example of that is to shift our thinking from men's behaviour change to thinking about how we support men in terms of safety and well-being and the role that they play in their families and perhaps more broadly in their communities to ensuring that. So interested to hear where you see these opportunities for reframing and why they're needed.
Thank you so much. The conversation's so fascinating. My mind's going 1,000 different ways. Look, I think strengths-based language is a way of inviting people to have a conversation. We can, you know, we can name the behaviour rather than the person. We can talk about we need to be accountable and take responsibility, not just for what has happened, but, you know, how we can change and how we can facilitate a conversation that isn't vilifying or judgmental. And doesn't make people feel other. We know from years of research that, you know, the more we ostracise and isolate people socially, the more they're going to feel, you know, emotions and not necessarily be in control of them. So I think that's that nuanced conversation where we say to people who have chosen to use abuse, you know, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to admit you've got reactions and feelings that you don't know what to do with. Let's go and find solutions. Let's help, you know, you to be the father you want to be, the mother you want to be, the, you know, the person who can keep your family safe and not need to compromise yourself or feel fear and shame in that process. You know, I really like Dr. Ross Green's work where he talks about people will do well if they can do well. And I think it takes us away from sort of that vilification into saying, well, help me understand what happened for you in that moment. You know, it wasn't okay and we need to not do it again. So how can we understand and make it different? And I love the work that often happens around the world, the word yet, you know, the powerful, you know, approach of, you know, I can't do this. Well, yet, you haven't learnt it yet. And it's not a forever finale of a situation. It's actually about saying it's a journey and we can change and that is possible. And it's about, you know, we were talking earlier, some of the panellists and I, about that difference between curiosity and judgment, you know, like, oh my gosh, look what you did, like versus, oh, I'm really curious, help me understand this. This hasn't kept people safe and obviously it doesn't make you feel good. How do we move forward? And that, I think, you know, is a really powerful part of including, and it is, you know, a gendered area, as we know, but including people who choose to use abuse in the conversations and not just looking at the victim survivors and saying, well, how do you think we should fix it? It's actually helping people to build skills and resilience in themselves.
Thanks, Anne. Daryl, I want to come to you now. Thinking about the really shocking insights of the Australian Child Maltreatment Study, which highlighted the impact that we've been talking about today, and showed, you know, 2/3 of respondents reporting maltreatment during childhood, and more than that, 40% of people aged 18 to 65 today reporting that experience of domestic and family violence as children. So if we think about what that means in terms of the ongoing experience of so many people, what would have been 2 in 5 children when they were, it's a real indictment. It's a staggering insight into the prevalence and therefore the urgency of getting better at identifying what's needed. And obviously in the context of a report looking at filicide as the worst possible outcome, we see that at the sort of most extreme end of a continuum of behaviour and therefore of impacts. So interested to, again, another small question, how we can prevent these deaths and also be thinking about what it looks like to address the broader issue of violence against children, thinking about strategies that focus on health and well-being and on enabling families to thrive. What can you share with us about that?
Thanks, Tessa. Look, what a great conversation to get into. Thanks, Anne, for your comments earlier, but particularly for the for giving us the okay to use four-letter words. So I've got my own four-letter word that I won't introduce. Mine actually does begin with the word F, the letter F, and it's fear. My fear that I have is that when we see such horrific statistics in a report like this, that we are, rather than being galvanised into action, that we become paralysed and see it as an overwhelming kind of problem without being able to make those links to prevention. So I really welcome the question, Tessa. I think that we have to hold on to hope, to come back again to your word, Anne. We have to hold on to hope that it is actually not just an exceptional problem that, you know, that we have to sort of, you know, see as an othering, if you like, of the people who do it, of the children who experience it, of the families, but rather see it within a broader context. And I see so many signs of hope in this report about those broader contexts of where prevention might have been able to lead to a different outcome. Tessa, you've already mentioned one of the great similarities with this study and the results of the Australian child maltreatment study, which is the incredibly high prevalence of exposure to domestic violence that we have seen historically. Unfortunately, even with our youth sample, the 16 to 24-year-olds, it's even higher. It's closer to, you know, it's over 43% of young people who have experienced domestic and family violence. So that's not that long ago when we're asking 16 to 24-year-olds about their experiences of it. So it is an enormous community problem. Where I have hope is that we can actually connect up these issues around how do we ensure safety of children from a relatively rare, you know, in numerical terms, but of course it's still the lives of, you know, 138 children. How might we have been able to do that? Well, to recognise the commonality between these other areas of actions. And Biljana, I was really pleased to hear you talk about that broader context of, you know, our societal attitudes towards children and the fact that violence against children in their own homes in the form of physical punishment is not outlawed in any state or territory. So that's one of the actions that I think our hope in, you know, taking this forward and actually adopting a prevention agenda can lead us to take serious action. But secondly, you know, when we think about the various services that this report highlights that, you know, families were coming in contact with, all of those are potential points of engagement. And as you've pointed out, Thea, it has to be more than just service contact. We actually have to make sure that those services are engaging. But it's not just those intensive services that are dealing with, you know, some of the really complex problems that, you know, that this the studies pointing out that, you know, we're experiencing, you know, broader domestic and family violence. Yes, obviously that's the main issue that has been focused on, but parental drug and alcohol misuse, parental substance misuse, those were exactly the same things that we found in the Australian child maltreatment study, more than doubled the risk of experiencing multiple types of child maltreatment. So that automatically then means that we should be bringing together the kind of child maltreatment prevention field and the Filicide and the DV prevention fields and having a common cause for action. And it is going to be some challenging things. It means calling out what's going on in families' lives. You know, we've already made reference to the things about parenting interventions and parenting assessments, but we also have to have wide-scale implementation of parenting supports. And I like to use the language of a public health approach to prevention. Just as, you know, we've had crises in things like, you know, cancer, you know, smoking-related cancers, you know, car fatalities and so forth, and we adopt a public health approach to those issues. We recognise what are the common causes, and then we have prevention-oriented strategies to address those. So, you know, with smoking, you know, we ban smoking in places. We have taxes. We have, you know, public health strategies about how you can get help. You know, the Quit campaign, etc. So what we have to do is find the child maltreatment and domestic violence prevention equivalents to that. And that does mean engaging systems like schools, who are coming in contact with most children and most families. You know, we've already mentioned maternal and child health services, broader health services, you know, GPs and so forth. How do we actually get them to be tuned into, you know, those early signs that somebody might be in need of additional support? And it has to be early because, as we see from this data, it might be very early on in a child's life that this risk that their lives will end manifests itself. So we can't wait, and we can't just have a response. We actually have to get things focused on prevention. But yeah, my real sense of hope lies in those commonalities between the child maltreatment prevention campaign, if you like, that we need to be engaging, and this broader one of preventing filicide as a sort of a narrow end, if you like, of a much broader problem of domestic and family violence.
Thanks, Daryl, and for that beautiful articulation of something you and I have been talking about for a few years now, about how we move beyond that assumption that child protection is about the identification of risk and the removal of children in that context, to thinking about what are the range of services and supports we wrap around children and families to enable them to thrive. I'm just going to pause and do a shout out to our audience, both in the room and online. As we said at the start, we've made the decision not to invite questions in this conversation now, partly to keep us tight and to time with such a range of experts here, and partly really to help look after everyone in this conversation because it has such very serious impacts on us all. But we are inviting your questions through the QR code, so you can see that slide now on screen, or you can see it if you're joining us remotely. And our commitment to you is to take some time to work with those questions and to come back to you after this discussion today, because we want the conversation to continue. So please do send through your questions through this QR code, and we will come back to you, not in the next 10 minutes, but at some point in the future. I want to come back to the panel now, and this is really just to open up to all of you and to any of you to reflect on the really clear insight coming through the report about the role of gender-based violence in this story about filicide. And so interested to hear from you, what do you think those insights are? What do you see in the research? And what does it mean for how we work with men and with women in the context of understanding the impacts of family violence on children? Who wants to jump in first?
Can I just a very short one,
up.
and that is to emphasise from a child perspective, it's both girls and boys who are affected by this, and I think that's where we should start our gendered conversation, is the gender of children, and that both are incredibly vulnerable when we don't protect and equip their parents with those prevention messages.
Thanks, Daryl.
I think, like Daryl, the issue of gender is a complex one, and that there are children who are killed by men and there are children who are killed by women. But the stories behind each gender killing their child is somewhat different, and we've been focused particularly on men. But domestic violence does percolate through to women perpetrators, because about a third of the women perpetrators have been victims of violence themselves. So the violence is a major issue. But as Daryl has pointed out, once you start putting in other risk factors, you increase the chance of filicide happening or increase the chance of maltreatment happening. So I think gender is quite not as straightforward as it might look. The answer, which I think we're all trying to move towards, is going to require all of us getting together over a very long period of time. And I'd just like to reflect on the fact that I worked in the family law service system, and the federal government decided to have a strong commitment to reforming that service system, and it did, but it took many committees, many years, many legislative changes. And I would like to think that we can eradicate filicide tomorrow, but we can't. It's going to take a huge effort on many people's parts.
and I'm just looking to our researchers now who will pull a face if I get this wrong, but I think when we're making sense of the experience of parents and perpetrators, also remembering that where intimate partner violence was a feature of the family violence, women who had killed their children were vast majority of people who'd also been experiencing that intimate partner violence. So again, those layers of complexity and understanding those impacts as part of that context in which that violence then occurs for children. I'm getting the nod, I didn't. Thank you. So then can I also just invite us to think about there are those immediate responses and supports that might see themselves as part of a family violence response system, and then there's that much broader context that we know plays such a key role: financial security, housing security, access to employment, access to community and connectedness for families. So just again interested in the panel's thinking about how we make sense of the gender dynamics of this violence, and particularly what that points us towards in terms of how we work with men and women going forward.
I might have a go at that one. I think, again, it's that story context, because when we look at the dynamics of domestic and family violence, many victims are feeling socially entrapped. And so when they're thinking about the context of whether I stay or leave, it is about where's the money going to come from? Where's the housing situation going to come from? Where are they going to live? Where's their bed going to be for them and their kids? So, do they have a job? How are they going to get a job? But this also plays in too, particularly if child protection is involved. So child protection will put in place a whole range of requirements on parents, particularly mums, around if they've been a victim of domestic and family violence, that, we're watching you, that if you're a Aboriginal parent and you've already lost your children, it will be that you need to have a house of a specific kind. In my housing study, the mums were told that not only did they need a house of a particular kind with a number of bedrooms in a particular kind of area, they needed to have a job. And the like. And so it is this notion of thinking through what does this look like, and is it feasible? How do parents and mums in particular hold this together? How do they make these decisions to look after themselves and their kids, and also recognising that the kids have views on this? So that decision to leave isn't an easy one, even though in our further ANROWS study on community attitudes to violence, the general Australian population thinks that it is easy to leave. It's not. And so I think, we as a society and as a community need to really think hard about how we're going to enable people to make these choices in a more fundamental way. And when we think about recent announcements around making available $5,000 for women to leave, it is contingent on them leaving, right? For some in our community, dad might be a good dad to the kids, right? He's just violent to you. And so what does that then mean if our policies are telling us that we've got to leave dad when culturally we still want dad involved in parenting, right? So we really need to think about how we structure our systems and our responses in ways that are supportive of a family that's in crisis, because we don't do that right now.
Thanks, Kylie. And can I come to you in the final minutes for the final word? You've talked about needing, from your own experience and from your own survival, needing to hold fear in one hand and courage in the other as we grapple with this truly devastating topic, but also plot a path forward and make progress on it. So would love just to hear from you what you would like people in this conversation to take away from the discussion we've had this morning.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I think what's sitting with me right now is the overwhelming urge to talk about trauma-informed approaches and care, you know, right down from what you're saying. And if we go to Dan Siegel's hand-brain model, how we put such expectation on people living in survival mode to make decisions that are sound and rational and logical and very well thought through. And that's not always possible. And although I'm going a little bit off my script here in my own head, but there's also a part about, you know, we don't ask people in crisis, we shouldn't be asking them and making them accountable for decisions and the behaviours of other people. We also have a court system that if, you know, both parents are deemed to be protective, then they leave it to a victim of family, and I say victim because they're living with it at the time. They then have to be even more accountable as a non-abusive parent, and they have to pay for that. The state doesn't step in. So I think at every level there are conflicting messages. However, all of that said, we do need to hold our courage in one hand and our fear in the other. And I often joke and say I realised I needed to just take another step, but having just lost my leg, it was actually going to be a hop. So I have a really bad sense of humour. But you have to laugh because, you know, there is so much joy and there is so much good in the world. And, you know, these are low numbers, but they have a devastating effect. But I like what Mark Twain said, and he said, courage is not the absence of fear, it is acting in spite of it. And I think that we can all act in spite of it. Although if I quickly, and I know we said no questions, but I'm just going to do it anyway. and don't panic, because I'm not going to ask anybody to actually do any of these things, okay? So I'm going to ask you to put your hand up nice and high, right, like you did at school. Okay, children focused here. Remember that inner child. And so if I ask you, can you sing? Could you please put your hand up if you can sing? Nice and high, not halfway, nice and high, that's it. You can do it on the line too, please. Awesome. Okay, thank you. I think we had about 10, would you say 10, maybe 12 hands? Thank you. Oh, very high, thank you, and down low. And who can dance? Hands up high if you can dance. Oh, there's some looks there. Oh, we're not sure on the end down here. I reckon we've got more dancers than singers. Okay, painters. Who can paint? Okay.
Walls count?
Well, that's a good question, a very good question. I think if we can give a round of applause to anybody who put their hand up for all three. So just put your hand up if you did all three, and the rest of us clap. Because when I worked with kids who lit fires, right, you would ask them that at the end, because they'd go, but I don't know how to do this and I don't know how to do that and I don't want to get it wrong. You'd ask these three questions. They would actually start singing. They would start dancing, and they would actually give you their painting to take home because they were so proud of it. And I would say to them, you can sing, dance and paint. I did not ask if it was the wall or a picture. I didn't ask if you were going to get paid and be famous for it. So we can all go sing, dance and paint. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That's a beautiful way to round out this panel. And please join me in thanking the entire panel for the insights that you've brought to this discussion today. As the panel relaxes from their incredibly important contribution, I want to invite now Kelly Hinton to come and close us out. Kelly is the Manager of Family Violence and chairs the Victorian Systemic Review into Family Violence Deaths in the Coroner's Court of Victoria. And she's here today as a member of the Death Review Network to reflect on what she's learned through this partnership and her hopes for next steps. So please come on up and join us. Thank you.
I don't know how I follow that panel. Thank you so much. Before I do just want to also that we are on Wurundjeri land and pay my respects to elders past and present, First Nations people in the room. I really love that concept of holding fear in one hand and courage in the other, and that's what I'm going to take away today. Thank you. I want to thank all the panel members for their insights and their passion, and they highlight how many of us just have something to say in this space and something to contribute. I've really appreciated today the focus on action and on hope. This is a really tough conversation, but I think I could sit here for the rest of the day and we'd still have so much more to say. I am really privileged to be part of the Victorian Systemic Review of Family Violence Deaths, and as Tessa said, we are a member of the National Domestic and Family Violence Death Review Network. The Death Review Network members consider and analyse the detail of family violence deaths in very different jurisdictions across Australia. We consider unique but also shared challenges within our local jurisdictions, and collectively we try to bring together learnings on a national level. The recent national crisis talks recognise the detail and depth of analysis done through death reviews, through coronial inquests and inquiries around Australia, and how important it is to understanding critical moments to intervention in family violence. I think this project highlights the value of the Death Review Network being able to partner with ANROWS on really important topics like this one, to increase all of our impact and try to reduce family violence related deaths. By partnering with ANROWS, the network's able to share our knowledge in a way that creates a sound evidence base that we hope will inform considered change. It takes a lot of work to pull together all the detail that each of the death reviews considers for family violence deaths, and I want to acknowledge the many people who put a lot of work into this research. More importantly though, I want to acknowledge all the children, families and communities whose stories devastatingly formed part of our work. While this research highlights key data on Filicides, I think network members are all too aware, and it's been spoken about in length today, that there are stories that go behind each and every one of these. This is our day-to-day work. Across Australia, small teams that form the network work hard to understand what happened in a family violence death, what went wrong, and consider what might change. But all of us witness these stories in our communities and in the headlines far too often, and I know I don't need to go into detail of recent horrific examples. I'm really hopeful that this research provides a sound evidence base to the many, many people and organisations working so hard across Australia to prevent and respond to family violence. I'm guessing this resource probably supports what many people in the sector already know or suspect. It again highlights the importance of seeing and responding to children as victims of family violence, including in the context of intimate partner violence. This research shows us the extent and the detail of the problem, and we've spoken a lot today about hope. Crucially, the research shows us some key opportunities for intervention and prevention where we can really have an impact and tailor local service responses while we consider the national opportunities for change. I started my career in a refuge for women and children many, many years ago. Change is really, really slow, but in my career I'm really proud to say I've seen a lot of progress, and it's thanks to a collective movement over many years, strong advocacy from so many people, and it's been underpinned by key evidence. I hope this research takes us all another important step forward, and I know the network and ANROWS have so much more we can do together in this space, alongside everyone else who's here, online, and working for change. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kelly. You talked about how long it takes to produce this level of insight, the painstaking work that goes into it. But I think also just to acknowledge how incredibly hard it is to do the work, how hard it is to make sense of it, and to grapple with the directions it points in the work ahead. And yet, it does give us that opportunity to think about how do we make progress, and that the learning informs the work that we do at a policy level for practitioners and for all of us in the communities that we're part of. So I really just want to take a moment to invite people to think about what you need to look after yourself in this conversation and in this work. We've shared some resources in terms of looking after yourselves today. People might have access to employment assistance programs if you're at work. There's a whole lot of people in this room, if you're here in person, who've got deep expertise in this thinking. For people online, to think about who you might want to speak to and debrief for yourself as you make sense of the conversation we've had this morning. And really just to invite you to reflect on a couple of parts of the conversation today that might help in making sense and in de-stressing, indeed relieving some of the impacts of that work. To think about what you've heard, to think about what you've learned, to think about what you find hard, and to think about where you can find hope, and to remember that for all of us, that is critical to providing a guiding star that we move towards.